Tempering validated research with over 20 years of on-the-ground experience building engineering organizations, we're changing the way you think to change the way you lead. Welcome to the TTL Podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the TTL Podcast. Mon-Chaio and I are going to talk this time about... What are we talking about, Mon-Chaio? Growth and improvement, just in general, just in anything we can think of, how to grow and improve.
That sounds like something we would talk about. We ostensibly are about technical leadership, but how much do we really talk about technical leadership?
I suppose maybe we should try to narrow that down a little bit into more of like, how can you as leaders grow and improve? Is it I just sit down and read a book and then I know it and I can do it? Is that all it takes, is just reading my entire bookshelf?
I mean, I think that that's at least part of what it takes. And we're talking about improvement because we're big believers in improvement, right? Otherwise, why would we be doing this podcast? The whole point of this podcast is to bring out new ideas to help you think differently so that you can improve. And so, in some ways, this podcast is a bookshelf, just in audio
Yeah.
form with a bit more rambling.
The number of times just before an episode where I actually run to my bookshelf and go and grab 2 or 3 books and sit down and start flipping through them, trying to remember what was in that, what was this one? Everyone listening will get a bit of a sense of what's on my bookshelf.
And I know we do want to focus on how do technical leaders, CTOs, all the way down to line manager, software engineering managers improve, or even tech leads. But I think in order to start there, we need to bring in research that's not specifically about technical leaders.
Mm,
It's about, is there any research on how do people improve skills in general? What are things that work and what are things that don't?
is that this article that you have about Scrabble?
So there is a lot of research on this, looking at various different aspects of learning. But I was really drawn to a set of research that talks about deliberate practice.
Yes.
And these folks, I believe it was 1989 or 1990. So, gosh, Andy, we're old. 30 years ago, was that?
No.
40 years ago.
Mm,
Over 40 years ago. Yes?
no. No, that's not over 40 years ago. I was born in
Third.
I was born in the start of the 80s, and I'm 44.
Okay, so 30 years ago. I was right the
Yeah.
first time. 30 years ago.
The computers do the math for us. We don't have to do this ourselves, so that's why we're terrible at
it. That's right. Datetime.now minus. Okay, so that was when I believe their first set of research around deliberate practice was published, and they had a set of things that they thought deliberate practice meant, and we'll go into that a little bit later. And in searching for disciplines where they felt like that was met, they ended up picking music. So musicians. And they studied what is the difference between musicians that succeed or have high skill versus musicians that just have average skill, and is it their teachers and whatnot. And then of course they had this hypothesis that it came down to deliberate practice, and that hypothesis was met there. Since then there's been a lot of studies, and this one that I picked out, this Scrabble one, is much more recent. I believe it was 2018 or 2019, something like that, so it was much more recent. The study was looking at what accounts for the difference between male Scrabble players having higher Scrabble ratings and being generally more skilled in terms of winning tournaments and winning matches than female Scrabble players. And what they found was it came down to deliberate practice. Now, what's interesting is when we think about practice in these disciplines, we often think, oh, well, there's a lot of different ways you can practice. But deliberate practice is something very specific. So I'm going to read the definition of deliberate practice from the original paper on musicians. There was one, the fifth one was added a little bit later, but the authors agree that these 5 are the set. So deliberate practice is defined as the task must be well defined with a clear goal and fully understood by the participant, the practice task.
Right.
Not
So it's
not
it's
the
it's not a it's not a sudden, "Here, do this thing. You've never thought of this before."
right. Or go practice this thing that like has many unknowns and you'll kind of figure it out, do your own research or
Mm,
whatever.
okay.
Number 2, the participants need to be able to perform the task by themselves.
Okay.
That's a little bit trickier.
Int
I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, but that's their definition. That's a clear need in deliberate practice. Number 3, the participants need to gain immediate information and actionable feedback on each performance of the practice task that allows them to make appropriate adjustments to improve. So this is short feedback
Right,
cycles,
yeah.
right? They need to be able to say, "Hey, I practiced this. This was good or was not good."
And what's interesting on that is that in this case, they're talking about violin players, was it? Or musical instrument?
I believe so.
Yeah.
I believe it was violin
And so
players.
it's not that they're getting a, "Oh, I liked that," or "I didn't like
Mhm.
that." They're getting very specific feedback about, "Oh, at that point in it where you played a G, I think you should have played the F sharp." I can't remember my music, so something like that. They're being told very
Right,
specific,
right.
actionable things that they should change.
Well, and that gets back to the first part. So if you understand the task well, my practice here is about transitioning from the G to the A
Mm,
in a way that's clear and consistent and doesn't have other notes in between it. Then you can do number 3, which is I did it. That task was well understood to me. Did I do
yeah,
that? No or
yeah.
yes,
Then
right?
I can say, you got most way there, but I could hear your finger moving along the string."
Right. Although if we take number 2, they have to perform the task by themselves, then the coach is not there. So there's we can
Yeah.
talk about
I
this.
I I I
Um,
wouldn't take by themselves, meaning without anyone else around. I would take by themselves as they can do it independently.
so there's arguments about that. I
Oh,
think for some of the authors, they really believe that practice is a solo activity. Now, I think and that actually made it very difficult. So when they went out searching for disciplines in which they could measure deliberate practice, there were a lot of disciplines that didn't meet the cut. Things like sports,
right.
where it was very difficult to find solo activity practice, not that they don't
Mhm.
exist. And so they picked music because it met that
Oh,
criteria.
interesting. Okay, okay.
Now we could, we can say, well, can we sort of extend it and does it still make sense even if the authors don't necessarily agree? That's a discussion I think is worth
Okay.
having. That was number 3. Number 4 is the participant needs to be able to repeatedly perform the same or similar
Yep,
tasks, right? That
yep. Do
repetition.
your scales.
Mhm. And then number 5, the practice task must be designed and performed in accordance with individualized instruction and guidance of a teacher. Now remember, this was the one that was added a few years later after their original paper. So that's the definition of deliberate practice. Getting back to Scrabble. Now, if you apply that, what you'll notice is it fits really well with the observed findings. So, as an example, they noticed that playing more games of Scrabble did not correlate with higher Scrabble skill.
Mm.
Now, you might say, well, that's practice, right? If I played one game of Scrabble and I play 1,000 games of Scrabble, I should be better in my 1,000th game than I am in my first game. But it turns out it doesn't. I thought that was super interesting that, like, in their study, they found that there was no correlation between skill and the number of Scrabble games you played. The thing that I found even more interesting is they found there was negative correlation with general vocabulary study and Scrabble
I've
skill.
heard this one, that non-native speakers are better at Scrabble than native speakers.
I have heard that one too. I didn't think about that until you just mentioned it, but I have heard that one too. And in the study, the authors talk about things like I can't remember whether Scrabble or word games in general, where they found that people's vocabulary only showed itself in that specific situation. So you might have a high Scrabble vocabulary, but then you sit down to write a paper and that vocabulary is non-existent
Oh, interesting.
for
Yeah.
you. So what did they find was predictive? Deliberate practice, specifically taking a game that you played and replaying it with either a coach helping you analyze each move or a computer program helping you analyze each move. And this fits well with other things like chess players. Apparently, that's also a great way
I
to
was
learn.
gonna say, you used to teach, or you still teach chess. I imagine that's a study technique for chess, is that you would take a game that the player went through, and then you just go through it again, and you look at this choice. You had these other choices to make. This would have been a better move because of these other things that could come later. That kind of thing.
Absolutely. And then sort of foreshadowing, you would then, as a individualized instruction, that's number 5 on deliberate practice, you would say, "The student is weak in these types of things. Now I can have" what would you call them? Like, practice problems
Mhm.
that aren't from real games or are from real games but aren't from the student games where they can repeat this over and over again. Here's another situation where you're supposed to notice, that there's an overloaded piece,
Right.
and so you're supposed to, stress that over and over and over again, right? And so what the paper found was they found that all of the difference essentially between men Scrabble players and women Scrabble players' skill was due to men doing more deliberate practice. They end up getting into, well, why is that? That's why I picked the Scrabble paper, is because I think there are things that naively we would think would lead to better Scrabble skill, but doesn't. And the only thing that they found did was this concept of deliberate practice.
Interesting. And that actually, to connect this back to management, leadership, that kind of thing, that fits with a paper that I found, which was looking at whether or not particular kinds of experience in a discipline correlated to better like leadership ability. In this case, they were
Mhm.
they were looking at NBA coaches,
Okay.
and what they wanted to do, it was a fairly simplistic study, so you can take this one with a little bit of a grain of salt, but it has been maybe worryingly the foundation of several other things that has gone on to. It creates, I think, a useful thing to think about, and it's, I think, what a lot of us have experienced as well. So it does fit that experiential check a little bit, which you
Mhm.
have to be careful with. And
Mhm.
what they found was they looked at the experience of NBA coaches and their experience, either as had they been a player, how much experience did they have as a player? Had they been a coach in non NBA basketball? Had they been a coach in NBA basketball? Had they been a coach for NBA basketball all the way through championships, through tournaments, into the high stakes, high stress stuff? And what they found was, going into it, you might think, well, just any coaching experience, well, if you just play the game, you'll get better.
Mhm.
What they
Mhm.
found was, no, actually, there is no correlation between non NBA coaching experience and their NBA performance.
Mhm.
But if they had NBA coaching experience, that actually did help them.
Interesting.
So that origin of your experience and the kind of experience you get. Now, there's other things that they get into, which we'll probably get to a little bit later, but it kind of fits with that idea around the deliberate practice of Scrabble, and just playing the game won't get you there. You have to
Mhm.
deliberately practice the game that you're going to be playing.
Mhm. I like it, and I think that fits well with some of the later research that we may talk about around what are the attributes that make a good engineering leader
Mm.
that people have tried to study. And foreshadowing, one of them is technical ability, and that has to do with, do you know the domain in which you're working?
And that connects for these NBA coaches, that one of the things that correlated to them having better outcomes as NBA coaches was, were they players? Did they play the
Interesting.
game? If they played the game, they know what in this case, their subordinates are going through. They
Mhm.
know what they're doing. They know how it's happening. The kind of like extension we can take from that is, possibly, if you're trying to manage a software engineering organization, and you've never done software development, you're probably not going to do very well, which is a thing that we've talked about in the past. That, like, do leaders have to be technical? And I believe the conclusion we came to was, yeah, you're going to need to be at least somewhat technical to understand what's going on.
Yeah, and maybe we'll have to augment our thinking there because I believe what we concluded there was you have to have a technical mindset, but you don't necessarily have to have done software development. It was
Oh,
the technical thinking.
see, I don't remember
Um,
what we came to, what conclusion we got to.
and I think that might be true, but it may be that in addition, if you have done it in the past, you're more likely to be a better leader of software engineers. So that's an interesting thing to think about. The next question in my mind then was, okay, so we think about this concept of deliberate practice being important,
Mhm.
right? So can we take that now to engineering leadership and talk about common things that we see people try to do to improve themselves and whether or not it meets the definition of deliberate practice?
Alright. What are things that I see that people try to do to, improve themselves? I
Hmm.
I I see them reading.
Hmm.
That's not deliberate practice.
No,
Uh,
I don't believe so. Right. I think we can both
yeah.
agree that like, there's no specific task. It's not repeating. You're not repeating the same paragraph over. Maybe if you read the same book over and over and over again,
But
maybe
you're
that could be
the key to me is that you're not performing anything.
okay.
You're
I
taking it
yep.
in, but you're not
Hmm.
doing anything with it. And I think that's a key
Okay,
part of deliberate practice is that you're doing something with what's in your head.
got it. Where you have to make a new
Yeah.
action, right? Okay, I like
Yep.
that. Okay, reading. Yep.
What are other things that I see people doing? Discussion groups where
Hmm.
you have kind of like mentoring circles, things where
Hmm.
you have discussions about things.
Hmm.
Is that deliberate practice?
Most often, it's not.
Yeah.
It can be if then you start to do some deliberate practice in your discussion group. So some discussion groups, very, very few, but I have seen some, will say, okay, well, help me understand that situation a little bit. I'll play this role, you play that role, and help me understand what went on. I think that's getting a lot closer to deliberate practice.
That's what I was thinking.
Most
If you get into that role play type setup, then I think you can get to deliberate practice.
right. But most of them, I think, is people complaining and then other people telling them maybe how to solve their problem or maybe complaining too. So, oh, I have an engineer and all they want to do is work on technical debt. And someone will be like, oh, I had an engineer like that. And what worked for me was I wrote in their goals, yearly goals, that they needed to be able to deliver value. And here's the KPIs I gave them. They said, oh, well, we don't have KPIs like that. And that back and forth,
Mhm.
I don't think is deliberate
No, no.
practice.
Well, and we actually have to ask ourselves from the definition that we had, do we wanna loosen it a little? Because by the definition, I think a role play is not a deliberate practice.
I agree. And this is where I was saying that, yeah, I think in my mind, I feel like I could loosen it a little bit and still meet most of the criteria for the deliberate practice. Did we want to go back
Yeah.
in for each item or do we want
To
to?
me, I think you only have to loosen one thing, and that's the participant needs to be able to perform the task by themselves. I think it's that they need to be able to perform their actions by themselves. So it's you kind of want the person to be taking their part, their steps in whatever dance it is you're doing without
Mhm.
the coach coming up and saying, "Now you put your foot here, and now you put your
Right,
foot there."
right, right. Or bracing them and saying, okay, I'm going to hold you to make sure you don't fall. Now do
Yeah.
this. And I think that there's a tricky balance here in terms of role play. I think in my mind, where when they are responding, they have their own creative thinking in order to respond themselves, I think is deliberate practice. But I think there are types of collaborative, what you might call practice, where your action depends on the output of someone else's action. They throw a ball to you and you have to catch it or
Mhm.
whatever. How they throw the ball impacts how you can practice the
Yeah.
skill. And so then I think it's less deliberate
Yeah.
practice. But yeah.
But I think you can still get there if you work out
Mhm.
a thing with the other person or the group that you're working with to say, "This is the specific activity we are practicing right now." And so
Yeah.
you throw the ball to me underhand, no
Mhm.
overhand throws. We're just doing underhand.
Yep, that's right. Okay, yeah, I agree. Okay, so reading, almost definitely not deliberate
Yeah.
practice. Discussion groups, maybe, but most likely
Yep.
not based on the way most discussion groups work. What else is there? Listening to podcasts,
That's the same as reading, I think.
same as reading, right? Ooh, Andy, how about this one? Just working.
Uh,
You'll have a chance to practice, Andy, because the situation will come up in work.
I think the thing about work is that, and I think this might segue us to another bit of this. The thing about work is you can't like produce and practice at the same time. And
Uh-huh.
so like I think for the deliberate practice stuff, we have no control over that situation really. It's just going to come up. So I can't practice things before it actually happens. I don't have any opportunity to, in most cases, I don't have any opportunity to do it again,
Mhm.
to have that high stakes conversation with a customer and then finish it off, think about it, get someone coaching me, and then say, "Yeah, this is how it would have gone better if you had done it this way." Okay, let's call them back up and try that again. It's not the same situation again.
I agree. And I think about this, there's a corollary in sports where they say a lot of the skill learning is done what they call during the off season, and almost no teaching is done during the season because it just confuses players. During the season, you're in competition. Your goal is to win. That means to execute the things you do best as many times as you can, not to execute the thing that might lead you to do something better 6 months down the road as many times as you can, so that in 6 months you're better, right? Because you're in competition.
Mhm.
And I think it's that way in work too. You can think about, let's step down from leadership for a sec to think about an individual software engineer who's saying, "Ooh, I read this blog post on an interesting way to do memory management in clusters."
Yeah, just implement that right into our cluster, management software.
Right. I mean, I read it. It seems great. Now, this customer is saying that memory is an issue. This appears to be more efficient. So I'm just going to implement it. I've never done it before. No one in my team's done it before. I'm just going to do it. That's high risk, right? That's not what you want. You want to do tried and true solutions so that people pay you money,
Yeah,
right? You're not a research lab.
and you wanna take those things and you want to put them into an environment of some sort of practice, we could call it deliberate practice, where you actually
Mhm.
learn about, do you understand it? Do you understand
Right.
how it can fail? Do you understand if it does start happening that way, how you'd recover? Um,
Mhm.
this exact reason, to take it to a slightly less implementation, but much more day to day type thing, is why a team that I worked with used MySQL database. Could have switched to Postgres, could have switched to a whole bunch of other database systems that would have possibly handled what they were trying to do better.
Mhm.
But the problem was no one knew, no one had like the hands-on experience, the practice, the experience of running any of those other database systems. And so it would have been a very poor judgment on that company's part for the engineers and the infrastructure group to just suddenly throw that new database system into production and say, hey, there we go. We had 10 years of experience of how to back up MySQL, how to tune it for the workload it had to run, all these other things. If you didn't practice the other one, you wouldn't have had a very good performance.
I don't think so, Andy. I think you're wrong. I think all you need to do is read the right blog post because they tell you exactly what to type. So
That is true.
just type that in.
That is true.
Or even better is you ask ChatGPT because it has read all the blog posts. So it knows which ones are bad and which ones are good. So you just tell ChatGPT, "Hey, look at my production topology
Yeah.
and convert me to
Yeah,
Postgres
here's my
storage." So
MySQL
you're good.
config.
That's
Write me out a Postgres
exactly.
config that's equivalent.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's all you need. All right. So obviously, just doing day to day work is also not deliberate practice. Um, Anything else we see? I guess mentorship, that's close to discussion groups most of the
Yeah, I
time.
think that's just
Most of the
yeah.
time, it doesn't have to be, but okay. Leadership seminars?
That sounds like a discussion group again. Or it could be a podcast type thing where you get talked
Mhm.
to. If the leadership seminar includes role play, maybe
Mhm.
we're back to that, like, if the role play is set up properly. Oh, what about all of those agile games, where
Uh-huh.
where you get the group together and you're like, "Here, let's learn how
Mhm.
Kanban works." And
Mhm.
you're all part of a factory and you're building this thing and you're
Mhm.
moving the stuff through. Is that
Mhm.
deliberate practice?
Interesting. I don't know. I think it could be. My my gut feeling is that it's not. But if I think about it, I think it could be you are taking a situation, these games, you're practicing them over and over again in order to try to learn repeatable skills. What did I fail with last
Mhm.
time? What went well? But you also don't get that immediate feedback about every step. You might retrospect after the game, each iteration of the game is over and say what went well, what didn't.
Yeah.
And that might help. And you're also not really able to do your action alone most of the time. A lot of that's very collaborative, people talking and saying, "No, I think, I think we should think about this queue over here, which is getting overloaded," or things like that.
Yeah. To me, a lot of it comes down to what is the skill that you're practicing? And in
Mhm.
a lot of those things, I don't think that there's really a skill that you're practicing. There's an experience that you're trying to gain. You're trying to gain this experience of like, oh, here's where a bottleneck is in the system.
Mhm.
That's what you see. But you're not really gaining the skill. And I would say partly because, well, you're not making little paper airplanes at work. So
Mhm.
you're practicing something that isn't even what you do.
I think it depends. I think if you think the skill is to be able to spot bottlenecks, that is a skill that you can practice through those
Yeah,
things. And I think that's a transferable skill
maybe.
to say, "Oh, well, in this paper copy of this game, I can look at my queue sizes as spot bottlenecks, or I can see a production line and see things slowing down and see that that might be a bottleneck there." I think that might be a transferable
Okay.
skill.
Okay. Maybe. I might go along with you on that one.
But I think that it's challenging, right? And I think in order to make a deliberate practice, somebody has to sit down and say, per number one, the task is well defined with a clear goal and fully understood. You have to decide what is it that you're deliberately
Yeah.
practicing. And I think for most people, it's very vague. It's just, oh, be better at
Yeah.
Kanban, which, like, I don't know. It is a skill, but it's so
Yeah.
broad that I don't think it means much.
It's more of a discipline than a skill. It's like there's all this stuff. It's like you're not practicing then. You're kind of getting an exposure.
Right. Now, so Andy, are we saying that mentorship, discussion groups, reading books, doing work, well, I mean, you have to do work, but doing work, those are not valuable? Just stop doing those. Those don't lead to better
Just don't do
performance.
work. No, I don't think so. I think what we're doing is we're saying those aren't deliberate practice, but deliberate practice isn't the end all be all of how you improve. Taking this through to other papers. Another paper I found, they tried to come up with this wasn't like an empirical study or anything. This one though was coming up with what did they think leadership development needed? And they proposed that you need deliberate practice. So
Mhm.
of specific skills, you would need deliberate practice of those skills. You need reflective learning, and that's where that more mentorship and those discussion groups come in. When they're done well, they become events to reflect on what has happened
Mhm.
so that you can integrate and you can uh, coalesce all of those random things going on and start turning them into something that you can work with that maybe identify a skill that you need to deliberately practice.
Mhm.
And then the third thing that they identified, and this was then connected to that NBA coach study, they called it the creation of experience density, which is a
Mhm.
weird term. I thought when I first read it, I was like, what? Basically, what they mean is it is in high stakes, high pressure scenarios that stick with people the most.
Mhm.
And so if you have sessions, if you have like work that is always just mellow, you're not really going to have many high density experiences.
Oh, interesting.
And those things then they don't have as much of an impact on your behavior. And
Interesting.
so their claim is that you need to have these high density experiences and then you need to reflect on them. And
Mhm.
those are the things that will really drive your behaviors. So this was for the NBA coaches. This was them being in the playoffs.
I see.
So the
Okay.
playoff, like getting to the playoffs, that's where there that seemed to have a strong correlation to their later performance.
Interesting.
And the hypothesis or the theory sitting behind this is that whole thing of like that experience really solidifies a particular mode of operating in them. And as I was reading this, I was like, that's a double-edged sword because you
Mhm.
you need to be conscious of what is the lesson you're taking away from that high stakes, high pressure, high stress experience. And I think that's where the reflective learning is critical. Because
I
if you
agree.
go into that like high stress experience and then you come out with the wrong lesson that you took away from it, if you don't have someone with experience to help you frame what to see in that, then you could end up solidifying something where you're like, oh, the only way to get ahead is yell at people. Where they're like, no,
Mhm.
no, no. Yes, you yelled, but that's not what caused this to work.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to reflect on this a little bit. I can see where they're coming from. I think oftentimes in high stress situations, the wheat is separated from the chaff, right? And so, especially in competitive situation like a sports game, you might think, "Oh, well, I want to do some player development here, and here's some trust building. So we're going to run some plays to allow people to trust each other or whatnot." But when you get to the playoffs, it's win at all costs or you're out. And so a lot of that falls away, and you start to figure out, "Oh, well, what are the things I absolutely need to do and do more of in order to move
Mhm.
on?" I think that's valid, and I think accumulating a lot of those experiences hardens you and gets you used to executing those experiences. But I'm not sure how well that necessarily translates into a technical organization. You might imagine the high stakes situation being a customer is breathing down your neck right now to ship software that you can't possibly ship at that
Mhm.
time. That's a high stress situation. What's ways that people have learned to cope with that? Things like cut corners on quality, things like, oh, well, we'll promise them something, but then we won't deliver exactly that thing, but they won't know because they don't see underneath it. We'll fix it later. We'll accumulate some technical debt. Are those the right lessons to your point to learn? And are those then the right lessons going back to some of our earlier episodes to execute in peacetime situations?
Well, so I'll actually take one of those as an example and say that it's not always the immediately obvious thing that you learn, or it's not the thing that happened in that stressful situation that you should learn from. Sometimes it's what got you to that stressful situation is what you learn.
Mhm.
It's like, oh, we are here because we did these other things.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
But because you're in that stressful situation, you will remember it more. So for instance,
Mhm.
I recall a situation that we got into at a company I worked at where we were not 100% honest with our customer that we were delivering to.
Mhm.
And we got into a mindset of our cycle time is faster than theirs. We can release to them faster than they can test our software. So it's okay for us to release things to them and and not tell them things that we know aren't working
Mhm.
because we're going to do another release before they even get to testing it that will fix the thing, and then it will make it look
Right.
like we released the stuff at the time that they thought we did. That came back to bite us. They got very upset with us, and the lesson I learned from that was actually one of like transparency. just being honest about it, being clear, and also having that clarity so that we can have discussions about the trade-offs around these things. So it wasn't that I took the lesson of you should never release something that's not working or that technical debt is bad or things like that. The lesson that I got out of it was um, you should make sure you have these honest conversations with people to avoid that situation.
Mhm. That's a real good yeah, that's a really good real life example. I like that one. All right, so we have what? We have deliver practice, we have these high density situations, and then we have the third thing, which is reflection,
Hmm.
right? Reflective thinking. And I think I agree with that paper. I think all three are necessary. I think they kind of feed into each other. To me, the high density situations and the reflection feeds into what you deliberately practice.
Yes.
Because if you don't have the other two, you're just practicing nothing or things that aren't useful. Maybe you have a coach that helps you through them, but I don't think it connects with you as strongly.
Hmm.
But also, if you have those other two, but you don't have deliberate practice, it's like the old adage, right? When you learn something, if you don't use it, 90% of it is gone something in like a week. Right. This is the why you go to conferences, you come back, and 3 weeks later, you're no better than you were before you went.
Yeah. And that even gets to, in this case, what how can you practice these things? Like, how do I practice being transparent with a customer?
Hmm.
How do I do that deliberately? And there I have a specific tactic, a specific structure that people can use. We might have talked
I
about it
thought you might.
before.
Yes.
It's the 2-column case study, and it's actually from
Oh.
the Agile Conversations book, their structure,
Hmm.
which is that you because all of this stuff in the end for leadership, at some point, it's coming down to some conversation you had. The first thing you do for your deliberate practice is you think about this conversation. So in this case, it might have been the conversation that we were having with this customer. And then you write down what was your goal in that conversation. You write down the conversation as you remember it. Doesn't have to be the whole thing, it can be just a section of it. You write down what your thoughts and feelings were. And now you have something that you can practice with. And the practice is, how do you have a different conversation? And there's different tacks on this. So you can say, how do I make sure that I'm curious? And so you look for ways in this conversation to be more curious. Or how can I in this conversation be more honest about what it is that's happening?
Hmm.
And what you do is then you actually practice it. You write down a different conversation and then you role play it with someone, and then you reverse that role play and you act as the other side where someone acts as you, so that you can experience the other side of it, and then you revise again and you just keep doing that until you're happy with where you get to, or you run out of time or patience.
Hmm.
But that's the deliberate practice of a conversation.
Yes. I really like that. You need to find a partner and hopefully not just a partner, but a coach that can help you out with that.
Yeah,
I think would be ideal because communication is such an important part of being a leader.
I think that's a great place to end this. And for anyone listening, these are things that we've coached people on, we've helped them practice on. We've got all sorts of ways of deliberately practicing various parts of these competencies that we think leaders need to have and these researchers think leaders need to have. So if you're interested in any of that, or if you just have a question for us, if you have some topic that you want Mon-Chaio and I to go delve into, to use the AI term, I've just heard that delve is the word used by the chatbots all the time now. Uh, just send us an email at hosts@the ttlpodcast.com, or you can find us on social media. On LinkedIn is probably the easiest place to find us. I'm not so much on X or Mastodon or anything
Mm,
anymore.
right.
So email. We'll just be old school. Email us if you want to get in touch.
Right. Because remember, we were both born in the
Yes.
80s, which was 40 years ago.
And if you have an organization that could use us to help you improve in any other way, please get in touch for that as well. We're here to help. Until next time, be kind and stay curious.